welcome to all of you, and welcome again to all who are watching this online, either now or later. And today, we are very, very happy to welcome our spiritual Shivananda brother, who will be speaking to us from Cape Town in South Africa. Swamiji, I think if he's not the head of the ashram, I'm sure bears all the responsibility, or a large portion of the responsibility, with a lot of help from others as well. And you may remember our Vaniji, who did the yoga here for so many years, so she's also there. And Swami, it's a very special day today. Today is the 29th of December, and it is, there's Vanny. Yeah, it is the birth anniversary of who this ashram is dedicated to, Swami Venkateshanandaji Maharaj, who is a leading disciple of Swami Shivanandaji. And Swami Venkateshanandaji, he served mostly outside of India, I think primarily in South Africa, Mauritius, Australia, Malaysia. Although he did travel farther than that, because my father, Swami Atmasrupanandaji, met him in 1960 in Vancouver. So last year they celebrated their Swami Venkateshanandaji's centenary, and this year they're celebrating his 101st birth anniversary. So, we're very, very happy that Swami Vidyanandaji is taking this time out to speak to us today, because he's going to be very, very busy with the celebrations today as well. And Swamiji's visited to the ashram many, many times over the years. You should actually come to the retreat sometime and in person. But this is the value of technology, is that we have the opportunity to hear you and your wonderful talks, at least online. So welcome, Swamiji. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Guru Brahma Guru Vishnu Guru Devo Maheshwara Guru Sakshat Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Om Sahana Bhavato Sano Bhunakto Savyayam Karavavai Tejasvina Bhatitamastu Ma Vidvishavahi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Anandoham Anandoham Anandam Brahmanandam 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 Anandoham Anandoham Anandam Brahmanandam. Sakravana ki jai. So, thank you, Swami Amritarupananda Mataji, for inviting me to be part of this year's retreat, the Christmas retreat. And I also want to thank all the senior Swamijis who have given me the opportunity to be part of it. And unfortunately, I never met Swami Venkateshanji. He passed away when I was 10 years old. I never heard the word yoga then. So whatever I'm sharing is only what I've learned here at the ashram, and also, of course, coming to Shivananda ashram regularly. Whatever I have learned, I can share. This year also is the 40th anniversary of Ananda Kutia Ashram, our ashram here in Cape Town. We just celebrated it about 4 weeks ago. The 4th of December was the day that the ashram was formally inaugurated. It was actually supposed to be inaugurated by Sri Swami Venkateshanji Maharaj, but he took Mahasamadhi 2 days prior to the actual inauguration when he passed away, or took Mahasamadhi rather, in Johannesburg on the 2nd of December. And it was Swami Venkateshan who actually gave the name Ananda Kutia to our ashram, although not to at this premises. Prior to the ashram being here in Rondebosch East, it was in a different suburb. It was actually a yoga studio of Mother Yogeshwari's. Mother Yogeshwari had started this yoga studio at her home. And in 1968, Swami Venkateshananda gave it the name Ananda Kutia, which of course was the name that Swami Shivanandaji had given to his first cottage, which is now Shivananda Ashram, a very big cottage. So I think it's what is now the dispensary, I think, was actually originally a little cow shed called Ananda Kutia. And so Swami Venkateshananda wanted to also call Cape Town's yoga center Ananda Kutia, and it became Ananda Kutia Ashrama. Why is it called Ananda Kutia? Because, of course, it is a cottage or a place, an ashram, that is meant to remind us of our true nature, which is Ananda, bliss. That is the whole point. And that is, of course, is the theme of this retreat, Ananda. So we are supposed to be Ananda Kutia, Ananda. We also just sang the song, Anandoham. This I learned at Shivananda Ashram, because as you all know, we sing it every morning at the morning meditation. We sing Anandoham. And I took it as part of my daily sadhana to also sing it at the end of my meditation practice in the morning. Admittedly, many times when I sing it, I think to myself, I don't actually feel it. In fact, this morning I'm feeling rather sad or not with it. I'm not feeling this Anandoham at all. And then one day I reflected upon it and I thought, actually, the song does not say I feel bliss. The song says I am bliss. So hence I'm not actually singing a lie. I'm not singing one thing and feeling something else, Anandoham, but I'm feeling lousy. The song is reminding us of what we are, not what we feel. And I think this is maybe an important point that was already mentioned in the previous talks by our senior Swamijis. The difference is between being bliss and feeling bliss or experiencing bliss. And maybe if we contemplate this, we can maybe get an understanding of the so-called paradox of bliss being all there is and yet experiencing sorrow. Because as long as we think of bliss as an experience, as a feeling, as an emotion, maybe even an elated emotion or spiritual emotion, then there will be an opposite called sorrow. Now, if bliss is all that exists, which is of course means it is permanent, then how can there ever be the arising of sorrow? It would negate the bliss. That's our feeling. But that's only as long as we think that bliss is a feeling, an experience. The song says, Anandoham, I am bliss. That may be something quite different. And maybe for us to get maybe a little better understanding of it is when we look at space. Now, we're all sitting in a space called a room. There's a space. Now, in that space, we can have some incense burning. It'll be a nice smell. And we'll say, oh, it's a good space. Or we can have some rotten eggs that have a different smell. And we'll say it's a bad space. But what happened to the space? Nothing. The actual space, the essential space, was still space only, nothing else. There was a temporary something called good space or good smell, and there was something called temporarily bad smell or bad space. But even while there was this good or bad, which is just our label, it is still space only. I think that is important to understand. It is still space only. And it is interesting because in Sanskrit, I believe, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but I believe in Sanskrit the word that is used for sorrow is dukkha. Now, dukkha has been translated into sorrow. Dukkha can be translated in many ways because it consists of two words, duhu and ka. And it has the opposite also, sukha. Also two words, su and ka. Ka means space. Duhu means bad or dirty. Su means good or pleasant. Du can be unpleasant. So there's a good space and a bad space. That's what sukha and dukkha means. And funny enough, in our English language also, we have this expression, good space and bad space, for how we are experiencing ourselves. Oh, today I'm in a good space. Oh, today I'm in a bad space. Sukha, dukkha. So we have a bad space experience and a good space experience, both being space only. That space, of course, is not physical space. It is psychological space. So our psychological space can be either good or bad, which means happy or unhappy. But we use it, it's interesting that we use this word, this expression. But what is psychological space as such? Is it not possible that the psychological space is just like the physical space? That even if there's something that is called good space, which means happiness, or bad space, which means unhappiness, could it be that the actual psychological space, the actual pure or essential psychological space, has never undergone any change whatsoever? That just like the incense smell or the rotten egg smell, it's just a temporary something in the actual space which does not undergo any change. Is it possible that even though we think there is a change in our psychological space, that actually there is no real fundamental change whatsoever? It is still only psychological space, never undergone any fundamental change whatsoever. Now, what is that psychological space? It is also called Chitta Akasha. In the Yoga Vasishta, it is called Chitta Akasha. The space, the mental space, the psychological space. And the Sage Vasishta points out that this psychological space is not essentially any different to Chit Akasha, which is consciousness space. I think this is a very important point, actually, that we probably miss all the time. That this consciousness space, and of course consciousness is bliss that we have heard now, is not essentially not different from the mind space. Or other way around, mind space is essentially not different from consciousness space. which means really, essentially, mind and consciousness are not actually different. The problem is we don't pay attention to our mind. This is the problem. We pay attention only to the externals, to which we, of course, we attribute sorrow. I experience sorrow or unhappiness because of external events. And then my attention is on these external events, which I feel are causing my grief. And whilst we're experiencing grief, we're not actually paying attention to this psychological space, which is, of course, now currently undergoing some kind of apparent change. It's only an apparent change. And this is actually brought out in the Yoga Sutras. Swami Venkatesanandi points this out through the Yoga Sutras. When there is no psychological change, no apparent change happening in the mind, that is called yoga. Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Probably most of us have heard this sutra, famous sutra. Yoga chitta, yoga ha chitta vritti nirodha. So this nirodha is when there is no psychological change. For whatever reason, it could be spontaneous, or it could also be because of some kind of practice you've done. Or Swami Venkatesananda points out, if we actually observe the mind keenly, with deep interest, through vichara, direct observation, then this nirodha can also happen. And when this nirodha happens, that means there's no psychological change. There's no change in the psychological space. And then, as the next sutra points out, tada drashtu sarupyavastanam, then you remain as your true self, which is that consciousness, the consciousness space. That's why Swami Shivanandaji said, consciousness plus thought is mind, as we heard the other day, and mind minus thought equals consciousness. So what is the difference between mind and thought, mind and consciousness? Nothing other than thought, the absence or presence of thought. And what is thought? Thought is merely an appearance, an event in the mind. But, of course, it is not something that is added to the mind. It is the mind itself. The mind undergoes a temporary change, and that is called a thought. But even that thought is nothing but mind. And since mind is nothing but consciousness, even that thought is ultimately nothing but consciousness also. The analogy that, of course, is always used is the analogy of the wave and the ocean. The wave is a movement in the ocean, but it is not in any different way different from the ocean. It is ocean only, nothing else. It's not something that is added. And even while the wave is happening, fundamentally and essentially, nothing changes for the ocean as a whole. Ocean is still ocean only. Wave is simply some superficial something that happens on the surface of the ocean. The very depths of the ocean, it is pure ocean only. So likewise, thoughts are just some superficial something that happens on the surface of consciousness. But consciousness essentially still remains only that consciousness. So this is experienced, of course, not as an experience, a subject-object experience, but this is experienced or known when the mind, when there are no thoughts, no modifications of the mind, then one realizes that actually my true nature is this consciousness or bliss. That's what it is. This realization is not mental, of course. It is, well, indescribable, they say. Indescribable. It's not something that we can think, because the moment we think, we're back into thought. And bliss is not a thought. Bliss is not a feeling. It is not something that is experienced like we experience anything else. They use the word experience, but it is anubhava. That is direct, immediate, and it is not subject-object. It cannot be positively described, because every positive description, again, is a thought. So we cannot think bliss, we cannot think about bliss. We have to discover it within ourselves, as ourselves. Discover who you are. Discover what the mind is. Because this is the key thing, actually, what I'm trying to point out here, is that we are not at this stage able to just enter into this bliss and be the bliss, be the consciousness. Because we are caught up in, first of all, we're actually caught up in the external world. That is our problem. As I mentioned, something happens and our attention is outside. Now, is it possible that when something happens outside, externally, to not be caught up in the externals, but to observe the mind? Because it is I now referring to the mind, that is reacting to the external situation. Something is happening within me while something is happening outside of me. Is it possible to observe this? Which means, of course, one begins to observe directly the sorrow. We're discussing sorrow. Of course, we can also observe happiness. Why should we not observe the mind when it is happy? But since our question is, and this is an important part actually, the question, if bliss alone exists, how come there is sorrow? If this question is really seriously asked, would I not be observing myself? If it's a perplexing thing. So if I really seriously and curiously ask this question, then I would be turning towards the mind. Because the answer to this question can only be found there. If I'm bliss, how come there's a sorrow? I have to see, how did this sorrow arise? How did this unhappy feeling, how did this dukkha, this bad space arise? And I can only know this by directly observing it. Now, this direct observation is called vichara. And Swami Venkatashananda translates, or describes rather, I would say, the word vichara as direct observation in which there is no thought. So we are not analyzing the mind. This is important. We're not analyzing the mind. There's no psychoanalysis, no dream analysis. In other words, you are not thinking about the mind. Thinking about the mind in order to understand the mind is called vitarka. This 17th sutra discusses vitarka, vichara, ananda, asmita, and so on. So vitarka may happen first. First, when we observe our mind, we think about the mind. But as Swami Venkatashananda points out, thinking about the mind is just thought thinking about thought. And can thought ever understand thought? No, you're still thinking only. So when we realize that thought is inadequate to understand the nature of the mind, then thinking drops and you enter into direct observation, thoughtless, direct observation to understand the mind, to understand this arising of sorrow. So you're looking at the sorrow, you're observing the sorrow to understand what is its essential nature, not why is it there, but what is the essential nature of sorrow. And Swamiji explains or describes that if one is able to continuously observe this with the view to understand or to see the essential nature of sorrow, which is thought, because that's what you begin to realize at first. You begin to realize when you look at your sorrow that it is a thought. We call it feeling or emotion. It's the same thing. Vritti is the Sanskrit word. Vritti includes all emotions, thoughts, or whatever happens in our mind. And mind is not only here, it's also in the heart. in the chest. That's the mind that we need to really be aware of. So when we observe that, you begin to see, actually, after some time, we may become aware that this is merely a movement of the mind. And if one is able to really penetrate into the very essence of this feeling of sorrow, one would actually discover the mind. Just like when you really focus on the wave in the ocean, you really look at that wave. What is a wave? Oh, it is water. It is ocean. That's what it is. And the moment you discover that it is wave, water or ocean, what have you discovered? The entire ocean. So, if it is possible to directly enter into the very essential nature of sorrow, of an unhappy feeling, you may discover the mind or consciousness. Bliss. What? There's bliss behind the sorrow? Is this possible? Sukha and dukkha are space only. Ka. Ka is the common denominator between sukha and dukkha. The common denominator is ka, space. Behind that, or the essential nature of it, is space. The essential nature of any psychological event, the essential nature of it is consciousness only. It is bliss. And of course, this is what freaks our mind. How can bliss become sorrow? It's only as long as we think that bliss is, we have a concept of bliss. We have a concept of bliss, that bliss must be happiness, the happiness that we know. But Swami Venkatashananda, when he inaugurated this Ananda Kutir in 1968, he described what Ananda is. He says it is that happiness which has no opposite. Unfortunately, he has to use the word happiness because there is no other word for this bliss. Bliss has no opposite. Therefore, sorrow is not the opposite of bliss. Sorrow is something that happens within bliss. Very strange. Yet, it's probably a very strange example to use, but it just comes to mind. We call it, it is a perversion, of course, masochism. You know, people get happy experiencing pain. It's called masochism. These two things can seem to be able to go together. Of course, this is not bliss. It's a perversion, but it's just an example to contemplate. That what seems to be opposite can coexist. But as we said, bliss is not the opposite of sorrow, nor sorrow the opposite of bliss. So we cannot reconcile this with our thought. This has to be discovered for oneself. We have to undergo this journey. We have to undergo the journey of self-discovery, of looking into our mind and discovering what is the essential nature of mind. And this is the other problem that comes with it. The problem is not the sorrow. The problem is we don't want to look at it. We refuse to look at it. We refuse to confront the mind. There's a funny story in the Yoga Vasishtha. The sage Vasishtha tells that once he was on a journey, he came to this strange land, beautiful land, forest and all that. And there he saw a man who had 1,000 arms. And in his arms there were whips and chains and all kinds of funny things. And with his 1,000 arms, he was hitting himself and crying and wailing because he's experiencing so much sorrow, hitting himself with his 1,000 arms. Occasionally, he also tickles himself with one of the arms and has a feather with one of the arms and so on. So occasionally he's also experiencing some kind of pleasure and happiness. But On the whole, because of these 1,000 arms lashing at himself, he's experiencing tremendous sorrow. And the sage Vasishtha says to him, but my friend, you can end this right now. No, don't tell me. Go away. You are a threat to me. Leave me. And he runs away. This is our problem. Yeah? So even when good advice comes, it is a threat. Yeah, we are strange. Because of course this mind, the man with 1,000 arms is just our mind with its 1,000 thoughts, lashing ourselves. We love to lash ourselves. That is why there's sorrow. We're lashing ourselves with our 1,000 thoughts. And even when the saints and sages come and give us wholesome advice, we don't want to listen. They are a threat to us. Everything is a threat. Everything is a threat. This is the problem, because within this consciousness, unfortunately, for some strange reason, this ignorance has arisen. As the Yoga Sutras also explain this ignorance has arisen, avidya. How can avidya arise? We don't know, but it is there. And out of this avidya arises the I, the ego. And then this ego enters into raga, dvesha, attraction, repulsion, and abhinivesha, fear. This is key. Who has created this? The mind only. We are bliss. But within that, somehow this funny scenario arises. And it happens to us every day. We all have hopefully had some good sleep, deep sleep. What do you experience in deep sleep? Bliss, ananda. Say ananda maya kosha. We experience bliss. And then within that deep sleep, suddenly a dream arises. What is the first thing that arises in the dream? I. I is the first. There's a me in the dream. And other. There's others in the dream. And we have experiences in the dream. And we suffer in that dream. Terrible suffering. It's called a nightmare. Who has created the suffering? The mind. Who's experiencing the suffering? The mind. Who can save us? The mind. Wake up. Unfortunately, of course, our waking up is again into another dream. When we wake up in the morning, exactly the same thing happens. The first thing that wakes up is the I. Then the other, all these things around me. And then I enter into the same relationship, raga, dvesha, and abhinivesha. Likes, dislikes, which cause nothing but sorrow, because if I like something, I have to dislike its opposite. I pursue that which I like, run away from which I dislike. All this running is 1,000 hands. All these 1,000 hands are raga and dvesha only. And abhinivesha. I'm frightened of so many things. Abhinivesha is not only fear of death, that's how it's usually translated, or clinging to life. You're afraid of so many things. Maybe the fear of death is the root fear, but we're afraid of so many things. Everything is a threat. And we're running away from everything, trying to run away. But where does the man with 1,000 arms run to get away from the man with 1,000 arms? Wherever he's running, this man of 1,000 arms is running. I'm running with my mind all the time. That's why, again, we heard it. You want to go to stay in an ashram. We can get away from all these problems. And what has happened? All our problems have walked in with us. Because the man with 1,000 arms has walked in with us into the ashram, into this Ananda Kutir here. That's why, as Swamiji points out, we make a hell out of heaven. If we die now, we hope to go to heaven. But we're taking this man with 1,000 arms with us. And what is this? It's this avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha. This is what we're carrying with us all the time. It is this what is living in us, through us, and creating our own sorrow and creating the sorrow of the world. You may say, but there's real sorrow in the world. Look outside, wars, battles, etc., etc. So much chaos, so much unhappiness in the world. Are you saying this is all unreal? Well, who's creating it? 8 billion men and women with 1,000 arms. Thank God there are a few exceptions. As Swami Shivanandaji said, it is the enlightened sages and sages that keep the world together. It is their peaceful radiation that keeps the world in one place. But otherwise, there's 8 billion people with 1,000 arms hitting themselves, running around. And some of them, we follow them also. And they tell us what to do. A man with 1,000 arms lashing himself is telling me what I must do. And I follow it also, because I myself am lashing myself with 1,000 arms. This is the state of the world. It's a wonderful contemplation, actually. If you think about it. That's why there is sorrow. Now, if we stop, let us just stop for a moment, pause, and study this man with 1,000 arms. Probably what will happen that those arms will simply flop down. And we begin to see that this man is nothing but thought, is nothing but mind. Nothing very serious, actually. And doing this vichara, looking, studying without thought, direct observation of this mind, we will discover that actually it was all just consciousness in movement. But when you discover this consciousness as it is in its pure state, that we call bliss. That we call bliss. It is bliss. That's what Swami Venkateswara points out. In the sutra, the 17th sutra, Vitarka, Vichara. So first, when we observe the mind, we might have some ideas about it. Then, when we really enter into this direct observation, or directly studying the mind, we will see that all our thoughts and ideas about the mind are totally inadequate and cannot give us any real knowledge of the mind. It is thought, thinking about thought. Then you enter into vichara. And at some point it may happen that this vichara reveals the very nature of thought, which is that actually it is consciousness, and therefore it is ananda, it is bliss. But Swamiji points out it's not enough, because there's still an I that is experiencing something called bliss. And therefore this I can again start the whole story again. So then at that point, one needs to inquire into the nature of this I. What is this I? This asmita. When the true nature of asmita, of the I, is realized, then that is called samadhi. Then we are in a state of pure consciousness. From there, it is highly unlikely that there's a return to this madness of the 1,000 arms. But even the great sages and saints do not rest on their laurels, so to say. There's a beautiful story of Gurudev, Swami Shivanandaji Maharaj, when he, at the end of his All India tour, he was in Delhi and he was resting at a devotee's house, and then he had to rush off to an engagement. And he rushed off. While he was in the car, suddenly he made the car stop, asked them to return to the home because he had not taken proper leave of the lady of the house. So he came in and prostrated and apologized to her. And when he was back in the car, he said, "Oh, from somewhere came the thought, I'm a great man." 2 months of adoration can do that, even to the most enlightened being. Because as long as we are embodied, there is this possibility. So even a great saint like Sri Swami Shivanji Maharaj had to keep constant vigilance of the mind, constant observation of the mind, not in the sense of suppressing thoughts or feelings, but this direct observation. Because when we learn to observe the mind, this is what will happen. The observation itself becomes the control. When we learn to observe the mind constantly, in the beginning, we may find we are out of control. The emotions are arising, we have no control. But we might find that the emotions also cease. After all, that's what a wave does. It might be a tsunami wave. So we might have a long period of some kind of upheaval. Learn to observe it without even trying to suppress it or express it. Observe it. You might find it comes to its own end. And if the observation, the self-observation, this vigilance, as Gurudev called it, if that becomes really more permanent in us, we might find that these waves no longer are tsunamis, they become little waves, smaller waves, ripples. At some point, they may not arise at all. That is when one becomes established in the bliss. So for me, personally, this teaching of Swami Venkatashanji, and that's not his teaching, it's the teaching of all saints and sages, he just emphasized this particular aspect, was so powerful and revealing to me. Because I'd studied psychology and so on, so it's always been, the mind has always been something to be mindful of. And here, what a profound teaching, that this mind, which we usually think of as an enemy, which we either want to suppress or run away from, actually, if you penetrate into the very essence of the mind, if you penetrate into the very essence of sorrow, of psychological distress, you can discover bliss. You can discover your true essential nature, which is this bliss consciousness absolute. Is that not wonderful? The answer is there. We are the answer to our own problems. It is most liberating. All it needs is turning towards the mind, facing ourselves, facing our problems. Not outside, inside. The problem is only inside. As often, I like to use this analogy. When the car is broken, it's a problem to me. It's not a problem to the mechanic. So the broken car is not the problem. The experience of the problem is in me. For me, it's a problem. For the mechanic, no problem. You'll say, "No problem, Swamiji." You'll fix it. So the problem is only in me. There are no external problems in this world. The problem is in me. Psychological distress is in me. I can face it. I can look into it. I can probe into it. Probe into that wave. And we may discover, to our great surprise and delight, that actually that is the very background of everything. That's the essence of everything. That is it. That is who I really am. That consciousness, bliss. Then all we need do, as long as we are embodied, is to try and remain there. Now, we need not necessarily wait for distress. You don't have to maybe prick yourself with a needle and see if I can now experience this pain and go into it. Even this method can be used for our japa. Again, we heard many times during this retreat the importance of japa. So when we do japa, it's the same thing. Can I enter and meditate or do this vichara unto the essence of the mantra? What is the essence of the mantra? We may find that that leads us exactly to the same thing. After all, the mantra, when I repeat it, it is an event within the mind. It is also a vritti. It is called Brahmakara vritti in Sanskrit. A vritti that leads you towards God. But how does it lead us to God? We have to discover its essential nature, that Chaitanya, Shakti, that consciousness, energy that is embedded in the mantra. So even in our japa, we can do this. Try and ask yourself the question, what is the essence of this mantra? What is it? What is its true nature? This will also lead us exactly to the same thing. And if we practice our meditation in this manner, we may find actually that the turning towards the mind and observing the mind in all its various conditions becomes natural. This vichara, constant self-observation, actually can become natural and effortless. And maybe this is actually how we can understand also Gurudev's song. It just came to my mind. Knowledge, bliss, bliss, absolute in all conditions. I am knowledge, bliss, absolute. What are these conditions? The conditions of the mind. Even while the mind is undergoing all these conditions, I am knowledge, bliss only. This we may discover. And we may just begin to discover that even if there is all this surface stuff going on, we may become more and more aware that in the very background, at least in the background of our being, we feel a kind of steadiness, a kind of peace. We're not there yet, but we may begin to observe it, because the observation itself is that consciousness, ultimately. So these are my thoughts that I would like to share with you, these wonderful teachings of our Guru lineage. And what better way to celebrate the birthday of one's Guru than to remember his or her teachings? Because after all, that is why they've come into our lives. That is why they exist, is to guide us. So may they continue to guide us all in our path to the self-discovery of that we are that bliss, Anandoham. Om Asatoma Satgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Mritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Sakurvana Ki Jai Shri Swami Shivananji Maharaj Ki Jai Shri Swami Venkatesanji Maharaj Ki Jai Shri Swami Chidananji Maharaj Ki Jai Shri Swami Krishnanji Maharaj Ki Jai. God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah. Oh, Swamiji, thank you so much. It was such a beautifully and clear reasoning to show us how bliss alone exists, even in sorrow, even what we label sorrow. That's what's so important for us to understand. And some of the points you also made, when you said knowledge, bliss, absolute, I am always knowledge, bliss, absolute, no matter what the condition of the mind, no matter what condition of the body, whatever. That song came to my mind also when you were speaking. And, and I also remember Swami Chidanandaji till the very end being so alert. That thought that can come, I'm somebody important, I'm being worshipped. And I remember that some devotees made him a throne to sit on, if you can imagine. And he refused. Yes. He refused to sit on that throne. He put it on the other side of the Samadhi hall, and a picture of Gurudev in it. And but anyways, your talk was just wonderful, Swamiji, and it's to share the approach that Swami Venkateshananda used, because although it is the teaching, it's the universal teaching, he does emphasize a particular aspect of it that is extremely helpful for us. And you're a wonderful representation of that in the way you express it as well. So thank you so much for sharing with us today and taking this time out. And we're also celebrating in our minds Swami Venkateshanandaji.
Yes, I know.
heart.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. Because we always ask somebody from either Swamiji or Veena Sharma who couldn't come. We invited her for tonight. She couldn't come tonight, but anyway.
Oh, I was wondering.
Yes. So thank you so much, and I do hope you and Vanaji will come back again. Come to the ashram for the Christmas retreat. Bring all your everybody there also.
Yeah, we pray that it will be possible soon.
Yeah. Good. Hari Om. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hari Om.